There was something special about Smackdown vs. Raw. After covering both the Smackdown series and every N64 wrestling game briefly on this channel, it only makes sense to also give some attention to the series of wrestling games that I actually played first. I remember looking forward to each release yearly when I was religiously tuning into WWE programming, and I've got fond memories of just about every entry here. For a bit of background, after 2003's Smackdown Here Comes the Pain, Yuke's and THQ continued to make wrestling games for PlayStation consoles, though they wouldn't stay exclusive forever. These yearly entries would drop the Smackdown branding and adopt the Smackdown vs. Raw title, and after Smackdown vs. Raw 2006, they would no longer be exclusive to Sony consoles. So instead of several concurrent series of wrestling games coming to different systems, all the major consoles would get the same Smackdown vs. Raw titles, which to be fair, makes more sense. I have to admit, even though I don't love the Raw games on Xbox, it was neat to have two separate series for different consoles. But ultimately it was the right move to consolidate their resources into one series of quality titles. I like every Smackdown vs. Raw game I've played, and I've had varying levels of experience with each game. Unlike the last two ranking videos I've made, I don't know every one of these games like the back of my hand. Some are all-time classics that I probably played as much as Here Comes the Pain or No Mercy, but the latter two entries were sort of under my radar, and I only played them more casually with friends. With that being said, I'm excited to revisit them and see where they fit within my ranking. Quick side note, sorry if the footage randomly switches platforms or you see some graphical glitches in the gameplay. Unfortunately, due to not owning a capture device, recording these games on original hardware isn't in the cards, so I have to use emulation, which on 360 and PS3 isn't totally there yet. That being said, let's get into it. Smackdown vs. Raw 2009 is definitely the weakest game in the series. It's still a pretty good time and can offer the same fun that any of these games can, but its biggest issues lie within content and presentation. The thing about yearly releases is that on paper, each game should be getting better, or should at least be adding features. But this game does the opposite. It's the first in the series to have a Road to WrestleMania mode, and I honestly really enjoy these modes. The problem is that they removed GM mode and a couple other features from the previous entry. Some of these really make no sense that they remove either. They removed the little area where you can fight in the crowd from the previous two games. Okay, why? Also, they could have easily basically copy-pasted GM mode from the previous game, but instead of that we have career mode, which is a fine inclusion. It just makes no sense that they'd call it career mode at all. This isn't a substitute for season mode or even 24/7 mode. It's a glorified way to change who's holding the titles in your game. Another huge thing that's missing is legends. Every Smackdown game since Here Comes the Pain has had unlockable legends, and this game only has two, Ric Flair and Taz. Turns out this was an intentional move to get you to buy Legends of WrestleMania, which is just lame. Give me unlockable legends, damn it. That being said, I'm one of the rare people who actually enjoys SVR08's gameplay. And considering this game feels practically the same, there's not a lot to complain about here. Yes, it's a bit slow, but that was a trend starting with Smackdown vs. Raw 2006 and only continued from there. There's a couple changes from the previous entry's gameplay here, but they're minor. Instead of charging the meter for your fighting style like the previous entry, you charge the meter and you can store a signature move. I actually kind of like this. It was a bit strange how in previous Smackdown games, some wrestlers with more than two finishers would just have them as basic grapple moves. Now they can have multiple finishers and multiple signatures, which I think is definitely an improvement. They also added the new hot tag maneuver, and it's fine. Not really anything to write home about, and it leads into one of my biggest problems with this game, the emphasis on tag team wrestling. Of course, if you want, you don't ever have to play a tag team match in the game, but on Road to WrestleMania mode, they force you into a lot of tag matches, no doubt to show off the new tag team mechanics. It was a strange time to emphasize tag matches for the company too, with the most prominent tag teams in the game being those who were in their prime over 10 years prior. Overall, I do enjoy this game because at the end of the day, it's Smackdown vs. Raw. But there's not a lot of reasons to boot this one up over any of the other ones. This game is notorious for perhaps not being the best follow-up to SVR07, and maybe the first big step back in the quality of titles that were being released yearly. I have a soft spot for it though. Most people's problem with this game is that they slowed down the gameplay a decent bit from the previous entries, and removed season mode and put 24/7 mode in its place. I'll be the first to say I kind of enjoy 24/7 mode, and don't think it's that bad necessarily, but it doesn't compare at all to the season modes of the previous two Smackdown vs. Raw games. What makes 24/7 mode unique is that instead of just going from match to match like previous games, you can do activities every day in between matches, doing things like signing autographs and training your wrestler to up their stats. This is a pretty cool idea on paper, but it does get a bit annoying, and after a while I always just end up simulating all the days until my next match. There's also just like a couple head-scratching moments here, like I just got viciously attacked backstage by Undertaker and Finlay, and now they're trying to be buddy-buddy with me literally the very next week, as if we're not even feuding. That's all pretty nitpicky stuff though, and the overall gameplay is still here and fun. The roster is great too. It's the very end of the Ruthless Aggression era, but you've also got a lot of legendary ECW guys for the first time in the series, as well as the first inclusion of Jeff Hardy since Smackdown Shut Your Mouth. There's also unlockable legends. Take notes, SVR09. This game's big gimmick is the fighting styles. Each wrestler has 2 to choose from before beginning a match, and they all have unique moves and characteristics. For example, a powerhouse wrestler can enter Rampage mode where they basically can't be reversed, and it's really fun. I think this was a pretty cool inclusion, and it certainly separates it from other games in the series. My only problem with it is that certain things like a strong Irish whip are now exclusive to powerhouse wrestlers, where in the previous 2 titles you could do them with anyone. Overall, even though it's a bit slow, and there's a couple issues I have with it here and there, I do recommend this game to fans of the series. It just definitely wouldn't be the first one I'd boot up. Smackdown vs. Raw 2010 surprised me. I've had a lot of fun playing this game for this video and have forgotten a lot about the game since I last played. The biggest thing that I can say about this game is that I feel like there's a conscious effort to make the gameplay a bit more quick and fluid again. Don't worry, I'm not talking Smackdown too fast or anything, but it definitely doesn't feel quite as slow as the previous 2 entries in the series. Once again, GM mode is missing, and we're not going to see it again until WWE 2K22, which sucks, but this game adds a lot of features. Chief among them is the story editor, which is incredibly fun to mess around with and create storylines. This was kept in a lot of later entries, and it's one of the best features of newer WWE titles. The Create a Wrestler mode is great, and I feel like they gave me a bit more room to get silly with it compared to the last 2 titles. Once again, a big downgrade from earlier entries is the lack of legends. This game only has 5, and Stone Cold was DLC. It's a shame that just because they were trying to sell you copies of Legends of WrestleMania, one of the most boring wrestling games I've ever played, you didn't get them in the main entries. Other than that, the roster is decent, with pretty much every recognizable face from 2009 represented. Road to WrestleMania is back, and it's still pretty fun. It's a decent substitute for the season modes of earlier games. Another problem I have with this game is that they pretty much remove the ultimate control moves. There's still the situational ones in the environment, but the ultimate control grapples are removed, and I'm not a fan of this. The ultimate control moves were really cool in earlier titles, allowing you to easily put people through tables or throw them off Hell in a Cell. Other than that, the control is pretty similar to the last few games in the series, but there's enough changes here to make this game feel fresh. Overall, SVR 2010 is a worthy title in the SVR series, and I think it's a really solid game. This game is an incredibly fun time, and one that I'm upset with myself for sleeping on for so long. Just about every improvement that SVR 2010 made over its previous entries is even more applicable here. This game is by far the best Road to WrestleMania mode yet, with great branching storylines. I love how you can walk around backstage between matches, talking it up or brawling with whoever happens to be around. This kind of stuff reminds me of Smackdown Shut Your Mouth, and that's a good thing. All of the modes that were added in 2010 remain, like Create a Finisher and the excellent Story Editor, which has gotten even better this time around. This game has possibly the most unique gameplay up to this point in the series. 2010 was a step in the right direction, but playing these newer SVR titles back to back like this has got me remembering just how little they really changed between entries gameplay-wise. Thankfully, they made a big step forward in this game, and that's mostly due to the overhauled physics system. Ladders can now be placed just about anywhere, even against the ropes on the outside of the ring. This makes the game feel so much more unpredictable, but also fluid. It's so much easier to put opponents through tables or do crazy high spots. The animations have been significantly improved. You can see here when I do a leg drop as Matt Hardy, the animation is accounting for when my opponent is standing instead of just having them awkwardly fall over. It's wild playing this game and realizing that it's 13 years old because it still feels incredibly modern. There's a lot of options here and you can basically approach it however you want. This is also the first game to have Universe mode, and even though it's a lot more bare bones compared to newer titles, it's still really fun. Also, I want to mention that I think this is the best looking SVR game since 2007. None of the games look bad or anything, but I personally think that the games between 2007 and 2011 look worse, and I can't totally pinpoint why. Overall, SVR 2011 is a blast, and I can see myself coming back to it often. It might be a controversial move for some to put the very first Smackdown vs. Raw game this high, but I really enjoy this game. Yeah, it's a bit similar to Here Comes the Pain, but all of these games are similar to their previous entries. I'd make the argument that this game not only stands on its own, but it's a very unique game in the series. This game introduces a clean versus dirty system, which basically works like a heel versus face system within the game. SVR 06 kept the clean versus dirty system, but it was implemented entirely differently, not having the same bars you need to fill up to access special abilities. Also, this game introduces these pre-match minigames, and even though they're nothing special, I actually like these and think they're pretty fun. This game has the first season mode in the Smackdown series to have voice acting, and though it's sometimes not the best...
Don't you get it? She's not interested. Take a hike. If you know what is good for you.
It's still a treat to have, and season mode can still be a blast. The biggest thing that they've removed from season mode is the ability to talk to other wrestlers backstage. To me, it was always weird how Shut Your Mouth always seemed the most fleshed out in this regard. Anyway, other than that, I still always have a lot of fun in this season mode, despite it being a little bit more bare bones than Here Comes the Pain. This is also undoubtedly the Smackdown vs. Raw title that feels the most like a game from the Smackdown series. And considering that's my favorite wrestling game series of all time, I just feel at home playing this game. I like the roster too. It's probably not quite as good as Here Comes the Pain or even SVR 06, but you've got a solid amount of unlockable legends and the legendary Smackdown roster of 2004. There's this create a pay-per-view mode, which isn't mind-blowing or anything, but it's a decent time sink. And there's also this new challenge mode, which I actually really enjoy. It's cool to set up matches to beat challenges, and you don't have to rely on season mode to get money for unlockables. They've unfortunately removed a lot of the backstage areas from Here Comes the Pain, and in its place is a parking lot brawl, which is modeled almost exactly from the actual parking lot brawl match that aired on SmackDown between John Cena and Eddie Guerrero. It's cool to play this for that reason alone, but it doesn't really compare to the multiple backstage locations of the previous two games. But I'd say that the gameplay is still there, the presentation is great, the create modes and season modes are pretty fun, and this is a really solid wrestling game overall that I definitely recommend you check out. I think a decent chunk of you watching might disagree with this placement, but let me clarify one thing off the jump. Smackdown vs. Raw 2007 is an amazing wrestling game, and just because it's not my favorite in the series, shouldn't take away from all the things that this game does right. It was the first game in the series to change up the controls, so that you grapple with the right analog stick instead of the circle button. And regardless of whatever control scheme you prefer, I think they nailed the transition with grace. I think this game still has the best control overall of all the SVR games that came after it. This is the first SVR game to have the ultimate control moves, and even though some people aren't a fan, I love these moves and I think it was the single biggest improvement from the previous game. The game's season mode is one of the best in any wrestling game. It's not quite as open as some of the earlier Smackdown titles, and you're still stuck to specific storylines like the first two SVR games. But the storylines are really fun to go through and it never gets boring. I had to give RVD the belt in my season mode because when this game came out in 2006, he was robbed of that title. Robbed! This game has a ton of unlockables and a great roster as well, also having legends unlike the later games in the series. It has the parking lot brawl from the first Smackdown vs. Raw and the bar brawl from the previous game too, and they get even crazier than before thanks to the ultimate control moves and new grapple system. SVR 07 definitely slowed the gameplay down a bit, but it's not super egregious yet like the next couple titles in the series. Big crazy spots are still fun and arcadey. This game has the stamina system that was added in the previous entry, and it's pretty annoying, but it's easy to turn off. And when you do, you don't even have to worry about it on season mode. So it's hard to complain about. The more options, the better. Speaking of options, there's a ton of match options and types in this game, and they even added in the Money in the Bank match for the first time. I think that graphically the 360 version is actually one of the better looking Smackdown vs. Raw games ever, and despite being the first WWE game on the 7th generation of consoles, it holds up incredibly well, especially for a game released during the Ruthless Aggression era. This really is a content-filled game, and one of the best that this series has to offer. Recently, it seems that this game has been given almost legend status and heralded in the same way that Here Comes the Pain and No Mercy are, and I think it's pretty well deserved. However, I do think that there's one game in this series that is just a bit better. It was tough putting this game above SVR 2007, but I just had to be honest with myself. They are both pretty similar games on paper, and it's ultimately just going to boil down to what season mode, roster, and controls you prefer. This game is a bit faster than SVR 2007 and feels more like a Smackdown title, and that's just personally the kind of wrestling games that I'm the most into. It has the same grappling system as Here Comes the Pain, but not quite the same identity crisis that the first SVR game has. SVR 2006 stands on its own because in my personal opinion, it's the best blend of the earlier Smackdown title's faster gameplay with the new features and voice season modes of the Smackdown vs. Raw games. That's not to say that they didn't slow things down a bit from the original Smackdown vs. Raw. They added in the stamina system, which would genuinely leave a very bad taste in my mouth if it wasn't so easy to turn off in the game's options. However, because the game is so customizable and open, I can't dock any points from it for having the stamina system on by default. The game is also jam-packed with features, as well as the first and, in my opinion, best GM mode. The season mode is great too, I'd say on par with SVR 07. It's more fleshed out than the original SVR and has a lot better voice acting. There were a lot of cool storylines in this game, like Eddie stealing the Undertaker's urn, as well as a whole storyline dedicated to ECW, which as a gigantic ECW fan is very welcome. Side note, this game came out the same year as the first ECW One Night Stand show, which is one of my favorite pay-per-views of all time, and that arena is unlockable. Even though it definitely doesn't look the same as the actual show, it's close enough and just a really cool inclusion. Yes, the later SVR games would have ECW as a full-on brand, and have a lot more of the OG ECW guys that they signed when they first started airing WWE's ECW on Sci-Fi. But it was still a cool inclusion, and I was happy to see ECW represented in a SmackDown vs. Raw game from 2005. I think between this and SVR 2007, it's definitely a very close call, but I remember playing this one more as a kid. I enjoy how it has basically the same grapple system as Here Comes the Pain, but it still definitively feels like a SmackDown vs. Raw title. It was also the first WWE game to my knowledge to let you change title holders in exhibition mode, and as a kid it was really fun to give my created Jeff Hardy wrestler the world title. In my honest opinion, this game and SVR 2007 are the games that are most deserving of your time, and I highly recommend them to anyone. That being said, I've really had a good time playing all of these games in quick succession like this. It reminded me of just how much I loved these games as a kid and definitely gave me a giant wave of nostalgia. From the surprisingly awesome time I had messing around with SVR 2011, to the more back-to-basics gameplay of the original SVR, to the overall solid experience that was SVR 2010, I had a great time playing each and every one of these titles in this series. The bar for quality in this series is so high that even SVR 2009 was still really fun at points, and I definitely enjoyed my time with it. You know, there's a lot of games that you play as a kid, and then you go back to them and sort of realize that they weren't actually ever that good, and you just love them because you were stupid. But that just isn't true for this series. It's nice to go back and have just as good of a time as you did years and years ago. So, thanks Ukes and THQ. And even though I wasn't a huge fan of AEW Fight Forever, I have high hopes for the future. Thanks for watching. I've taken the time to set up a Patreon page for the channel. It's brand new, so it's pretty barren right now, but soon I'm going to be uploading exclusive content like short edited reviews of games that wouldn't ordinarily warrant a full dive on the main channel. With that, you'll also get early access to videos and ability to vote on what video comes next for the channel. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, the link's in the description.